Set apart from the rest of the world, seeing what others cannot, stands the ultimate figure of fantasy legend. Billowing robes, a mysterious staff, a reaching tower filled with books no one else has read. They speak in riddles. They arrive precisely when they mean to, and almost never explain why. They hold power over forces that should be beyond human reach, and they wield it with unsettling calm. We know them immediately. We have seen them hundreds of times. The wise old mentor, the arcane scholar, the keeper of secrets, the manipulator of kings. Perhaps the most familiar archetype in all of fantasy, the wizard. But that familiarity might be obscuring what they actually are. So let's set aside what we think we know. Where did the wizard actually come from? What has defined them across history, mythology, and centuries of storytelling? And what is it beneath the magic and the spectacle that actually makes a wizard? As with all of these archetype explorations, I like to get a sense of what the designers of D&D were thinking when they penned their descriptions into the rulebooks. These give us a picture of what elements they thought defined the wizard and how they sought to spark the imagination of players sitting down at the table to roleplay. In my 1978 copy of the AD&D Player's Handbook, the class was originally called the Magic User, with a subcategory of Illusionist. Something tells me that might have been a copyright consideration, but whatever the reason, this is one of the earliest formal descriptions of the wizard in the game's history. Magic users draw upon arcane powers in order to exercise their profession. While they have mighty spells of offensive, defensive, and informational nature, magic users are very weak in combat. When a magic user begins his or her profession, the character is usually assumed to possess a strange tome in which he or she has scribed the formula for some of the spells known to the character. The spellbook must be maintained by the magic user. He or she must memorize and prepare for the use of each spell, and its casting makes it necessary to reabsorb the incantation by consulting the proper book of spells before it can again be cast. It was also noted that a very high intelligence was paramount to playing the class effectively. By 1989 and the second edition, the class had been officially renamed the Wizard, now with subcategories for Mage, Specialist Wizard, and Illusionist. Schools of magic had also become a significant part of the class identity, most likely as a way to give players more defined mechanical playstyles, though historically the wizard was understood as a figure who sought to reign over all domains of knowledge equally. The wizard group encompasses all spellcasters working in the various fields of magic, both those who specialize in specific schools of magic and those who study a broad range of magical theories. Spending their lives in pursuit of arcane wisdom, wizards have little time for physical endeavors. They tend to be poor fighters with little knowledge of weaponry. However, they command powerful and dangerous energies with a few simple gestures, rare components, and mystical words. And in the 2024 Player's Handbook, the description has expanded considerably, and I think it does the archetype far more justice, capturing something of their uncanny relationship with knowledge and power. Wizards are defined by their exhaustive study of magic's inner workings. They cast spells of explosive fire, arcing lightning, subtle deception, and spectacular transformations. Their magic conjures monsters from other planes of existence, glimpses the future, or forms protective barriers. Their mightiest spells change one substance into another, call meteors from the sky, or open portals to other worlds. Most wizards share a scholarly approach to magic. They examine the theoretical underpinnings of magic, particularly the categorization of spells into schools of magic. The closest a wizard is likely to come to an ordinary life is working as a sage or lecturer. Other wizards sell their services as advisors, serve in military forces, or pursue lives of crime or domination. But the lure of knowledge calls even the most unadventurous wizards from the safety of their libraries and laboratories and into crumbling ruins and lost cities. Across 5 decades of design, one quality remains constant: study. The compulsion to understand is where the archetype begins. The word wizard arrives in English from the Middle English wizard, built from wise, W-Y-S, meaning wise, and the suffix ard, which historically implied intensity or excess. A wizard is, in the most literal sense, someone who is excessively, almost dangerously wise. That suffix carried a faint edge in Middle English, a suggestion that the quality it described had been taken further than was comfortable. A drunkard drinks too much. A braggart boasts beyond reason. A wizard knows more than is perhaps advisable. There is a subtle warning built right into the name. English has several words for this figure, each arriving from a different tradition and a different understanding of what this kind of power is and where it comes from. Those distinctions represent other spellcasting classes, and we will return to some of those in future explorations. But what is worth noting here is that the word wizard specifically claims wisdom as its origin. Wisdom pursued, accumulated, and taken to its furthest possible reach. That idea began much further back than medieval England, with a priestly caste that the Western tradition has been borrowing from ever since. The Magi were a hereditary priestly order in ancient Persia, operating within the Zoroastrian religious tradition from roughly the 6th century BCE onward. They served as court advisors, astronomers, interpreters of celestial signs, and guardians of sacred fire and ritual practice. Their authority rested on systemized knowledge, an understanding of the natural and divine order, carefully accumulated and maintained, and held within the boundaries of their caste. You could not become a Magush, you were born one, and their knowledge was secretly guarded. When their reputation traveled westward through Greek contact with Persia, the word traveled with it. The Greeks rendered Magush as magos. The Latin world received it as magus, and from magus came magia, and eventually the English word magic. Every time that word is used in a rulebook, in a novel, at a gaming table, it carries the trace of these ancient Persian scholar priests inside it. The Magi planted the idea the wizard archetype would carry through every culture that followed, that to know more than others is itself a form of power. But that idea would not stay locked within a hereditary priesthood for long. One singular person representing this idea appeared. Gerbert of Aurillac was born in rural France around 950 CE and traveled to Catalonia to study, a point of contact between the Christian and Islamic worlds, returning with a command of mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy that his contemporaries could not account for. He built mechanical devices that astonished the people around him, rose through the church with unusual speed, and in 999 CE became Pope Sylvester II, the first French pope in history. He was also widely rumored to be a sorcerer. Studies circulated that he had made a pact with the devil in exchange for his knowledge, that his learning was too vast, too precise, too far beyond what an ordinary man should possess. Gerbert had simply learned more than the world around him knew how to explain. That gap between what one person knows and what their world can account for is where the wizard materializes, and it would not be long before that gap became mythology. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote his Historiae Regum Britanniae in 1136, roughly a century after Gerbert's death. Within it appeared a figure drawn from older Welsh prophetic tradition, a mysterious, preternaturally knowing advisor to kings whose understanding of events exceeded what any ordinary man should possess. His name was Merlin. Geoffrey's Merlin is not the warm-hearted sage of later tradition. He is something stranger and more unsettling, a political instrument, a force that shapes the destiny of kingdoms from the edges of them. He engineers the circumstances of Arthur's conception through deception. He He advises kings according to patterns of history he can see and they cannot. His counsel is rarely comfortable. He arrives when something needs to be set in motion, and then he withdraws. By the time Thomas Malory develops him in La Morte d'Arthur around 1485, Merlin has accumulated the qualities of the archetype we now recognize: ancient, knowing, possessed of power held carefully in check. Malory also gives him the ending the archetype had perhaps always been building towards. Merlin is eventually imprisoned by Namue, his own student, using the very magic he taught her, undone by the knowledge he chose to share. But Merlin is where the archetype crystallized. Vast and solitary knowledge, counsel offered to those who hold power, origins that resist easy explanation, and a cost for reaching too far. He is, in almost every meaningful sense, the first character that looks like the wizards we know now. The history that followed produced no shortage of real-world figures who looked to the world around them like something close to what Geoffrey of Monmouth had described with Merlin. The archetype was alive in the real world long after it had taken mythological form, in figures like Cornelius Agrippa, whose exhaustive pursuit of occult philosophy made him a marked man across Renaissance Europe. John Dee, who advised a queen by day and attempted to speak with angels by night, and even Nostradamus, whose prophetic writings made him both court advisor and an object of genuine fear. But it was in fiction where the wizard would be fully realized, where writers would push the archetype to its furthest edges and test what it was really made of. When J.R.R. Tolkien published The Hobbit in 1937, he introduced a figure so precisely constructed that the entire weight of the wizard archetype seemed to settle around him like a cloak. Gandalf arrives at Bilbo Baggins' door entirely certain of his purpose. He is old beyond reckoning, possessed of knowledge no one around him can account for, and he dispenses that knowledge very carefully, offering exactly what is needed and rarely more. He carries a staff, he smokes a pipe, he moves through the world at his own pace and on his own terms. He's ancient, knowing, and operating according to patterns that others around him cannot yet perceive. The wizard, as Merlin, established him. Tolkien embedded something beneath that surface deliberately. Gandalf is a Maya, one of an order of lesser divine beings in Tolkien's cosmology, sent to Middle-earth by the Valar to aid its peoples against the growing shadow of Sauron. He was appointed, and with that appointment came a precise and binding limitation to guide and inspire the free peoples of Middle-earth. Every time Gandalf chooses counsel over direct action, he is honoring the terms of his purpose, which is to be an instrument of guidance to Middle-earth. Tolkien drew consciously on Norse mythology in shaping him. Gandalf's appearance, the wide-brimmed hat, the gray cloak and long staff, the wandering from place to place dispensing cryptic wisdom, maps directly onto Odin in his guise as a wandering old man. Tolkien was a scholar of Old Norse and Old English literature, and Odin's identity as the relentless and costly pursuer of knowledge is woven into Gandalf's bones. The name Gandalf itself appears in the Old Norse Voluspa, a list of dwarf names that Tolkien drew from and eventually gave to Gandalf. When Gandalf falls fighting the Balrog in the mines of Moria and returns as Gandalf the White, his mandate expands. He acts with greater directness, orchestrates even more forcefully, and moves the pieces of the war against Sauron with increasing authority. The wizard whose defining quality was restraint steps fully into the power he was always capable of wielding. The Gandalf who returns is a different instrument than the one who arrived at Bag End with a firework and a knowing smile. Tolkien gave the wizard archetype its most enduring modern form, a figure whose power carries the most weight precisely when held in careful reserve. That image has shaped every sage, mentor, and arcane counselor in popular fantasy that followed. When J.K. Rowling published Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone in 1997, she did something no writer before her had quite managed. She took the wizard archetype and built an entire world around it. Schools of magic, ministries of magical governance, a hidden society operating alongside the ordinary one. The wizard was no longer a solitary figure standing apart from the world. In Rowling's books, the archetype became a civilization. That expansion reached an audience of hundreds of millions and reshaped the cultural imagination of what magic looks, feels, and lives like. And at the center of it stood Albus Dumbledore. Rowling's headmaster of Hogwarts portrays the warmest expression of the archetype in modern fiction. Endlessly patient, gently humorous, possessed of a wisdom that seems to encompass everything. But Rowling built something considerably more complex beneath that warmth, deepening across all 7 books of the series. In his youth, Dumbledore was brilliant, ambitious, and drawn to the idea of wizarding supremacy, that the more powerful should guide and perhaps rule ordinary people for the greater good. He formed an intense alliance with Gellert Grindelwald, a dark wizard who shared and amplified those ideas. Their partnership ended in a confrontation that killed Dumbledore's sister, Ariana, a death whose precise cause he never fully resolved and carried as a wound for the rest of his life. That failure shaped the man the wizarding world came to know. His patience and restraint, his refusal to seek power for its own sake, these are the disciplines of someone who knows exactly what he is capable of and what it once cost. He defeated Grindelwald in 1945 and declined every offer of political authority thereafter. He's also a man who manipulates. Harry Potter is guided, protected, and ultimately prepared for sacrifice according to a plan Dumbledore guided across Harry's early life, a plan he never fully disclosed to the person, Harry, at its center. The wizard guiding those around him without asking permission, that thread connects Dumbledore directly to Merlin and to Gandalf. But there's also another expression of the wizard that asks what happens when the archetype's defining quality, the accumulation of knowledge and power across a lifetime, is turned not toward guidance or protection, but toward complete control. Joe Abercrombie published The Blade itself in 2006 and introduced a wizard who is, on first appearance, exactly what the archetype promises: ancient, imperious, possessed of knowledge that dwarfs everyone around him, the first and greatest student of the founder of magic himself. He arrives with purpose, assembles a company of unlikely individuals, and sets the world in motion according to a design only he can fully perceive. Bayaz, first of the Magi, is Abercrombie's most precise piece of craft, a character constructed to look exactly like Merlin, exactly like Gandalf, but reveals something else entirely. His wisdom is indistinguishable from arrogance, his guidance indistinguishable from manipulation, his vision for the world indistinguishable from a desire to control it. He does not advise kings, he makes them and unmakes them according to his own judgment across centuries, with a patience that has curdled into something cold and absolute. Bayaz never announces himself as a villain. He operates entirely within the logic of the archetype. The wizard knows best. The wizard sees furthest. The wizard's long view justifies the short-term cost. Abercrombie simply follows that logic to its conclusion. A being who has accumulated enough knowledge and longevity to believe his judgment supersedes everyone else's is a tyrant who has learned to dress the part. He is the archetype examined without flattery, and one of the most carefully realized wizard characters in modern fantasy. Some wizards follow the archetype's hunger for knowledge, for power, for understanding without limit to its darkest possible conclusion. Saruman the Wise was, like Gandalf, a Maya, sent to Middle-earth with the same mandate: to guide, to inspire, to counsel. He was the head of the order, the most learned, the most capable, and it was precisely that learning that undid him. Saruman studied Sauron to understand him. He studied the One Ring, its history, its mechanisms, its power. He acquired knowledge methodically and deliberately of everything the enemy represented, and somewhere in that long study, the boundary between understanding evil and desiring it dissolved. He fell through his own expertise. The wizard's defining instinct to know a thing completely consumed him in the knowing. Voldemort traces a different path. Tom Riddle was among the most talented wizards Hogwarts ever produced, brilliant, disciplined, and consumed from an early age by a single question: what lies beyond the limit? For Riddle, that limit was death itself. The pursuit of immortality through Horcruxes fragmented his soul, distorted his humanity, and produced something that had accumulated enormous power at the cost of everything that made power worth having. And then there is Vecna, a human being who pursued arcane knowledge with a ruthlessness that left destruction in its wake, achieved lichdom, and eventually ascended to godhood through centuries of obsession. In Dungeons and Dragons lore, he is the endpoint, the wizard who broke every limit and became something that no longer resembles its origin. He is a destination, the answer to the question of what happens when the wizard's hunger meets absolutely nothing that can stop it. Each of these figures began where every wizard begins, with the desire to understand. The principle that separated Gandalf, Dumbledore, and Merlin from the path that these three walked was a willingness to value something more than the pursuit itself. That question, what are you willing to become in exchange for what you want to know, has a name, and that name is older than any of these. The name I'm referring to is Faust, and the story it carries is the wizard's shadow. The historical Johann Georg Faust was an itinerant alchemist in the early 16th century Germany with a legend attached to his name. It was whispered that he had bargained with the devil in exchange for knowledge and power beyond human reach. This legend found its earliest literary form in the Historia von die Johann Fausten, a German chapbook published in 1587. 5 years later, Christopher Marlowe brought it to the stage. Marlowe's Faustus has mastered every discipline available to him: philosophy, medicine, law, theology, and found them all insufficient. He turns to magic out of appetite. He wants more than human knowledge permits. He makes a bargain with Mephistopheles, knowing full well the terms. Yet what he does with his 24 years of supernatural power is interesting. He plays pranks, he conjures grapes out of season, he summons the shade of Helen of Troy. Marlowe understood that the hunger itself was the point, that the desire to exceed human limits carries no guarantee of anything worth doing once those limits are gone. Goethe returned to this story, publishing the first part of his Faust in 1808 and the second in 1832. His version is more philosophically generous. Faust is restless and genuinely seeking meaning, and the bargain becomes a wager about the nature of human striving itself. The Faust tradition presents the wizard's hunger as the archetype reaching beyond its limits. To dedicate a life to understanding what others cannot access is to live always at the edge of what human knowledge permits. The question the tradition asks is what the wizard is willing to do when they get there. In 1950, American author Jack Vance published a slim collection of stories set at the end of the world. The dying Earth takes place in a future so distant that the sun is nearly spent, and magic has become the dominant mode of understanding a reality that science can no longer explain. The wizards of Vance's world practice their craft through a precise and demanding discipline. Spells are located in books, studied, memorized with enormous effort, and held in the mind in a delicate and temporary state. Cast the spell, and it's gone. The wizard returns to their books and begins again. Gary Gygax cited Vance directly when designing the magic system for the original game. The The spellbook, the memorization, the prepared slots, the casting and forgetting, these are Jack Vance's invention, basically carried wholesale into the rulebook and distributed to millions of players ever since. The mechanical identity of the D&D wizard has a specific literary origin, and that origin is that 1950s paperback, The Dying Earth, where magic is practiced at the end of all things. What Vance proposed and what Gygax preserved is that the wizard's power should feel earned and finite. The spellbook is a discipline. The memorization is the cost of wielding something that demands a life in pursuit of it. The mechanics encode something the archetype has carried since the fires of ancient Persia, that this kind of power is inseparable from the devotion required to hold it. That devotion is what defines the wizard above all else, their insistence on understanding what others simply accept. The willingness to follow that pursuit wherever it leads, toward wisdom, toward power, toward ruin, or toward something that reshapes the world entirely. What all of this adds up to, I think, is that the wizard is the person who cannot stop asking what lies beyond the next horizon of understanding, who makes knowledge their entire reason for being and pursues it above everything else. As we've seen, the line between using that pursuit for good or for ill is thinner than any of them ever expect. Maybe it's that understanding, the kind that reaches beyond the scope of what most people can comprehend, that makes the wizard truly magical. I'd love to hear from you. What characters embody the archetype for you? I know there are so many that I could have talked about in this video, but I'd like to know what you think makes a wizard.